And welcome to a truly brain-rotting edition of Ben's Junk. Brain-rotting because we're going to do the TV thing, and specifically TV series on DVD. So I guess in a way that's a bit contradictory as opposed to watching it over the air, but whatever. I own a lot more of these things than I'm showing here, and I'm going to show a lot, but we'll call this around half of the collection, and I'll mention when I have complete series or multiple seasons of it and that sort of thing. So anyway, let's kick things off with something I watched probably too much of as a kid, and those would be Britcoms, at least ones I could get here. British sitcoms, British comedies. And one that I have kind of a odd relationship was one I first saw in middle school. I liked it even though I didn't really understand it. There were a lot of historical references I didn't get, and from that you should know what that was. Blackadder. And the odd thing about this was I hadn't seen Mr. Bean yet. So when I finally did see Mr. Bean, it seemed very strange for Rowan Atkinson, who is very articulate in this and has that great voice, to suddenly be, kind of bumbling Mr. Bean and barely squeaking out any words at all. But of course, if you're not familiar, each season or series, since we're talking British, takes place at a different point in history, but he plays the same character, who's a conniving piece of garbage. But yeah, it's one of those ones that's kind of like a fine wine to me, because as I've gotten older and I've learned more history and stuff, it makes more and more sense, and I enjoy it that much more. And I dig this out once a year, at least, for the Christmas Blackadder episode, which is kind of buried in the special features here. It doesn't fit in any of the main seasons. So, running with that, when I was a kid, this was probably the first Britcom I ever got into, and I had the whole series on VHS at one point. I don't anymore. But at one point in a thrift store, I found the complete Fawlty Towers, and I watched it so much for like a year on those tapes that I had that I could almost recite these things. And I haven't watched an episode of this in a few years now, but I was still able to remember a fair chunk of it. And of course, as am I making this, John Cleese has been kind of kicking around a new season, new series of Fawlty Towers, and I'm just kind of thinking, why? Some of the cast is dead, some have major health problems, some are retired, and I just don't see how it would work. And trying to start something like this back up after 1979 would have been the last time. That's just too much distance as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, moving on. When I was in middle school, I watched way too much Comedy Central. And there was a period of about 2 years where every weekday, while I was at school, I would have the VCR set to record their midday stuff, which was an hour of Kids in the Hall, followed by the original British Whose Line Is It Anyway, which is far and away my favorite iteration of the show. It's certainly the purest. And Clive Anderson is far and away my favorite host that the show has ever had. And it's one of those things that I never really think about in terms of influence, but when I step back, it's kind of like I think I might have gotten a little of my process from these early seasons. Now, this is only the first 2 seasons, and as far as I know, at least here in the States, we never did get the rest of them on DVD. So this is all I've got for the British version. But yeah, it holds a pretty good place in my blackened heart. Now, at the time that I was watching this, it was just about the time that the American version was getting started with Drew Carey. And I watched it, and there were times where it was really good. But at the same time, I learned pretty early on that it wasn't like the old British version. They would go back and revise things. They would try things over and over again. Sometimes somebody from the network would say, you can't say that, and they'd have to go back and do the same bit or the same concept and take another crack at it. And so it's supposed to be improv, but it does kind of lose some of that edge. And it wound up being a nice, slick product in the end, but it just it didn't do it for me the way the British version did. And yes, I have seen the more recent one. It may still be on. I can't think of the woman that hosts it, of her name, but it feels like the ship has sailed when I watch it now. It's just gone on too long. Even the best shows have an expiration date. So getting back to the midday Comedy Central thing, I mentioned Kids in the Hall. I have accrued all 5 original seasons of Kids in the Hall on the original A&E sets, and in varying degrees of condition. This one's a little beaten and a little faded. They were all used. But getting back to Kids in the Hall, it's another one of those things that I wouldn't even necessarily call it an influence, but I know it kind of was, and I can see where it informed my process a bit. Now, before you ask, yes, I have seen the new Kids in the Hall from the last year or so on Amazon, and I enjoyed it for the most part. There were a lot of times where I was like, yeah, they're back. They still got it. The first episode, I was a little worried. It got off to a great start and just kind of fell off. But starting with episode 2, for the most part, it was like, yeah, they still got it. All right. And I didn't really care that much for Death Comes to Town when I was in college back in the mid-2000s. So I was a little worried. But yeah, I hope Amazon gives them another season. I think they deserve it. So Canadian sketch comedy. You know where this is going. SCTV. And Lord knows I have referenced SCTV enough times on Archive. Now, funnily enough, I only own 3 out of the 4 Network 90 sets. The significance being the couple of years that they were on NBC and the time slot was 90 minutes, so Network 90. And there has been a compilation of earlier SCTV shows, because it would have been in its 4th or 5th season by the time NBC picked it up. But I haven't picked it up. I will if I find a really great price on it, but I don't want just little stray episodes. I'd rather have a complete season at least. And it just hasn't happened yet. The final season, which was only on Cinemax, here in the States at least, has never turned up in any reissued form. But yeah, had to get that in there. So let's just roll with the sketch comedy thing here. I only own the first 2 seasons, but here's the first season of SNL, Saturday Night Live. And this is interesting mostly from a historical perspective. And I am kind of one of those proponents of the early SNL. It's really one of the few times it felt kind of dangerous and kind of new. But this first season is them just getting their bearings, and even the network not really knowing what to do with them. Initially, it was more like a standard 70s variety show. There's at least one episode in here where there's no sketches at all, per se, save for Weekend Update, if you consider that a sketch at all. And it's just kind of interesting watching it slowly come into focus, slowly starting to gel. But yeah, and watching reruns of this on TV as a kid, back when E would run the first 4 or 5 seasons in reruns, I got turned on to a whole lot of bands and artists that I would have never heard otherwise. All right, one last sketch comedy thing here, and at the moment I've only got the first season, but I've got a major soft spot for Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. Dated as it is, just the way, certainly the earlier episodes are put together, you can see where the influence came from on a lot of subsequent stuff. Now, funnily enough, I had never seen the last, I think, 2 or 3 seasons until just like a year before I left Colorado. I used to watch the reruns of this on a channel called Trio, which was owned by Bravo. It's long gone, but they would only rerun the first 2 or 3 years of it. And so it was interesting to see how it progressed. And it did. And the pace really relaxed towards the end. It's kind of surprising because when you think Laugh-In, you think of everything is very breakneck. And it's an hour-long show, but it can feel a lot more because there's just so much. There's so many little parts. But I was pleasantly surprised with the later seasons. It seemed to pace itself a little better. Even if there weren't any big names, it felt more confident. But yeah, I've been kind of holding out for a good price on the complete series instead of me just rounding up individual seasons, unless I find it in a thrift store or something like that. So anyway, moving on, since we're doing that 60s thing, here's a definite old favorite for me, and I think for a lot of my viewers. The Monkees. And I do have both seasons of their show on DVD, and once upon a time, this particular set, plus season 2, were kind of sought after. And this has been on Blu-ray now once, but it was only a short run and it was very expensive and I didn't have the money for it at the time. But I guess the Blu-ray one is what's really being chased now. Now, of course, this was on Rhino, and Rhino loved their gimmicks. Rhino had already put out the complete series on VHS in a big box set, and it had kind of a gimmicky thing going on in there. And they also had the individual tapes of 2 episodes apiece, and I owned a lot of those. I've only got like 2 or 3 of them now. I've gotten rid of most of them. Just nostalgia keeps me holding on to the ones that I've got. But yeah, this was kind of a big deal to me when I got these, and I saved the back part that was trapped in the shrink wrap at the time. But yeah, Rhino loves their gimmicks, or at least they used to. So they've made this like a little portable record player. You got the would-be speakers back there, would-be turntable. And in there you've got your collection of DVDs, but they're all designed to look like period 45s. They're all based on actual 45 picture sleeves from the Monkees. Now, I first saw these on Nick at Night as a kid. I was like 9 years old, 8, 9 years old. And when I found out that they weren't a real band, I couldn't believe it. And I just hated them for a while. And it was only, somebody pointed it out to me. I was making fun of them when I was starting to do music stuff on some forum. And somebody was like, you know, they did do some of their own stuff. They did function as a band at times, and maybe you just want to go back and listen to that stuff again. And I had the greatest hits as a kid and all, and it got me to go back and to really appreciate it. But yeah, there's the other set just quickly. This is getting out of hand. All right, let's run with the 60s thing a little longer here. One of the first sitcoms I really loved, and I was one of those kids that watched a lot of Nick at Night. And so when I was in grade school, I guess it would have been, I got into Get Smart. And I have never entirely let it go. It's still a show I really enjoy. Now, this stands out in that initially this was one of those Time Life deals where you had to order it, call the 1-800 number and all, and you bought one and then you'd have to sign up to buy the subsequent seasons. And I was just a college kid, but I did it anyway. It is the only time I've ever done anything like that. So yeah, these are the original issues from 2006 or so, 2006, 2007. It's since had a complete series box and a version that sold in stores. But yeah, this is the truly original real deal. All right, one more 60s thing, and I think I'm going to have to take a cut just to clear the deck here. So where do I fall on the great 60s TV controversy? Munsters or Addams Family? I enjoy the Munsters. I will not turn down the Munsters, but Yeah, I'm in the Addams Family camp. I think it was just better written, better characters. Really, The Munsters was just a normal 60s sitcom that just happened to have a monster family, whereas this feels a little more developed. Again, I don't mind the Munsters. I won't, turn my nose up at them, but yeah. All right. All right, from here on out, I'm going to try and take things in roughly chronological order. Let's see how much I succeed. So, when I was a teenager, TV Land had this thing on Friday and Saturday night, I think it was, called The Kitchen. Kitsch. Kitsch. You get it? We'll play on words. And it was the Monkees and Mary Hartman, and Fernwood Tonight, and it was hosted by Martin Mull and Fred Willard, the stars of Fernwood Tonight. But I had never seen Mary Hartman before, or Fernwood for that matter. And it was one of those things that I normally hate not sitcoms, soap operas, but it's a parody of a soap opera. And this one walked a very dangerous line between parody and actual soap opera. But when it stayed on the parody side, it was very good. And this has had a full series set now, but the price hasn't come down enough to where I really want to pick it up. I think it was still like $150 the last time I saw it. And I think they put in some Fernwood Tonight episodes with it too, which was a spin-off of this. That's kind of weird, a parody of a talk show being born out of a parody of a soap opera. Now, if Fernwood got a proper full series release, I'd be all over that one, even if it were on the pricey side. But yeah, you had this, and a couple years later you had Soap, and Soap was kind of goofy, but it was all right. So it's kind of like I wish I could take the best of each show. And I think the real problem with Mary Hartman was that they tried to treat it like a real soap opera. This thing ran 5 days a week like a normal soap opera, and it shouldn't have. It should have been once a week. It just wound up being a little too close to a real soap. All right, so we're going to hang out in the 70s a little more here. I picked this up at Walmart, of all places, just like a couple of years ago. And I didn't pick it up initially because I love WKRP. It's another one I used to watch a lot in reruns as a kid. But the first time around on DVD, it was missing most of the music. Of course, it's a radio station and a rock station, and they played real stuff and oftentimes hits. Well, Shout Factory did their best to clear as much music as possible, but they didn't quite get it all. And the reason I didn't pick this up initially was one song, Dogs by Pink Floyd. For whatever reason, Roger Waters and or David Gilmour just wouldn't agree to let them use that bit again. So Dr. Johnny Fever is playing Dogs, and that song incorporates dogs barking at times. The boss walks in and he hears those dogs, and he's looking all around thinking there's actually dogs in the studio. And it's a nice exchange between the two of them, but here it's just generic music and redubbed voice actors, and it loses its punch. Now, thankfully, that bit is on YouTube from somebody's old off-air recording, but that is what held me back from picking this up. But when I saw this at Walmart and the price had come down quite a bit from its initial release, then I finally got it. Now, this next one's just a few random episodes, and this is from when Warner Brothers was testing the waters by putting out single DVD sets of like 4 to 6 episodes of whatever show. And if it sold well enough, then they do the seasons, if not a complete series. So this is the only one I've got. Welcome Back, Cotter. And this was another Nick at Nightism for me when I was a kid. And I would have been in grade school at the time. And watching it, it's a teacher and his students, takes place in high school. I remember thinking, when I get to high school, I sure hope I have a Mr. Cotter. And I did. And I was fortunate enough to have him I think, my entire run of high school. I think I wound up with him for homeroom for 2 years and other classes for the other two. So if by some insane fluke you're watching Mr. Shurik, I do think about you occasionally. All right, so let's do another 70s thing here. And I mentioned this on the most recent Bad Sitcoms episode, where it was bad movie-based sitcoms, and I was talking about the new Odd Couple. And I mentioned that one of the stars of New Odd Couple had been in one of my all-time favorite shows, Barney Miller. And this is one of the few times that I've bought the complete series set of anything. And it's the only time that I bought it sight unseen when it first came out, when I put in the pre-order and plunked down that initial price for it, which I think was north of $100. And it's taken a little abuse from me. It's been on and off the shelf quite a bit. So I love this show. Of course, it's a cop show, but it almost entirely takes place in the squad room of the 12th Precinct, New York City. And I normally hate cop shows, but I like this one because it's just so well written. It's got such great characters, and it's probably the most accurate cop show, strangely enough. It's a comedy, but it's just about kind of the everyday line of lunatics that come through the 12th Precinct in this case. Whatever little petty crime they've committed, whatever little disagreements they have, and it just works. Because when I think cop shows, I think especially the newer stuff like NCIS and CSI, where every case is the case of a lifetime and oftentimes well beyond what most people see in their law enforcement careers. So I give this one points for keeping it real and also just being funny and well written. So I guess if I do Barney Miller, I'm going to have to do Night Court, huh? So of course you have a certain overlap in crew, writing crew, directing crew from Barney Miller. Now, I've got a few seasons of Night Court, but strangely enough, I like these early ones better. Even though the cast hadn't gelled yet, there's just, it was Barney Miller, really, all over again, just in a courtroom, in a night court in New York, and just kind of about that line of various lunatics and petty thieves that would come through. And I used to watch reruns of this all the time growing up, and I would kind of lose interest towards those last few seasons because it just got so silly and so slapstick. But yeah, I've got a good soft spot for this. Yeah, they're rebooting this thing. I saw the preview. I was not impressed. Maybe I'll watch an episode just to see how I feel truly about it, but yeah, it's way too late to try and reboot something like that. All right, let's run with the 80s thing here. And I liked the 70s Bob Newhart show, but I've just always been more attached to the 80s one. The one in Vermont, you know, at the inn. But I've especially always loved this first season of this show. It's got a totally different flavor from any of the other seasons, and it's one of those shows that got too silly for its own good in its last 2 or 3 years. But here it's a very low-key thing, and it's more about just the day-to-day goings-on at the inn and about the relationships. And it's another one of those deals where the cast hadn't really gelled yet, casting hadn't entirely happened yet. But damned if I don't love it. And it stands out in that it was shot on videotape. I think the rest of the series was on film, so totally different flavor, and it feels a lot more intimate. So I picked this up on a thrifting episode just in the last couple of years, and it was a nostalgia trip for me, at least when I picked it up. Not so much when I tried to watch it, The Wonder Years, which I only remember seeing in its first run right at the end. Otherwise, it was on one of the local UHF stations in Denver, and later on the Family Channel. But looking at it just in the last couple of years, I'm kind of like, maybe that's one of those nostalgia things I should have just kept in my mind. I don't know. I'm sure somebody will give me hell over it. So I think it ran almost the exact same years as Wonder Years, but a very, very, very different show. And I've only got this one season, Tales from the Crypt. I've been holding out for the complete series set at a decent price, or maybe finding the others, individual seasons in the thrift store. And I'm pretty sure this was pre-archive when I got it. Still got the price tag on it. But it was a bit of a shock when I saw this, because I watched this as a kid, but I saw the edited versions that would air on over-the-air TV stations. I think it was Channel 2 in Denver on Saturday night. And in some episodes, of course, didn't get syndicated at all. So, yeah, my family didn't have HBO growing up. We had cable, but not HBO. And so I wasn't aware that this got quite as dark and quite as bloody as it did. So, yeah. Still love the Crypt Keeper, though. All right, we had WKRP earlier, so I guess we better do the 90s version, news radio. So just swap out the rock station for a news talk station. And we got the Kids in the Hall connection, don't we? Dave Foley. I've rounded up all but one season of this show just from scouring thrift store bins, and I missed this somehow in its initial run, but I saw it on A&E like in the early 2000s and just loved it. And watching it in the last few years, it's held up surprisingly well. It's definitely got some of those 90s isms going for it. But for the most part, it's a very good workplace comedy and a really nice ensemble piece. Now, this next one was kind of my great Sunday night tradition for the 2 or 3 years that it ran. And I would do Simpsons and stuff, but my real favorite was Pinky and the Brain. And I liked Animaniacs prior to this, but I loved the Pinky and the Brain cartoons within it. So when it got its own show, I was all over it. And when it came out on DVD, damn right, I picked up the whole thing. Almost. I did not get the ones with Elmira from Tiny Toons. I couldn't get into that one, strangely enough. I don't know why they were jamming two completely disparate shows together. All right, I kind of gave up on new sitcoms in the 2000s. So I've got 2 here from the 2000s, mid-2000s, and I gave up on them pretty early in their run, but I really liked them early on. So I have seen the British version, but my first exposure to The Office was the US version. But I just loved the earlier episodes, and I especially loved season 2. And then it just started to become a repeat, a constant repeat. I mean, the whole thing was a mock documentary, but with that, you need the characters to continue to grow. You need relationships to continue to happen, and it just never did. It was just the same thing over and over. It was like a self-imposed arrested development going on, no reference to the other show. And I just gave up on it after season 3. So on a similar note, and a show that I have not seen in reruns, My Name is Earl. So in this case, a guy who's done a lot of bad things in his life turns himself around and is trying to right all the wrongs he's committed in his life. And it's a really nice concept, and it was really well done. And I gave up on it after season 2 or 3 because it just kind of ran out of steam. It just didn't have a deep enough well of ideas to run that long. Now, this show used a lot of hit songs, so I think that might be part of why it hasn't seen much, if anything, in terms of reruns. Again, I have not seen it in reruns. And for what it's worth, my DVDs have all the songs intact. So anyway, I still own a bunch more TV DVDs, but I think that ought to do us for now. So with that, I'm going to close things here and just say I'll talk to you again soon.